has gone before, the best of that which lives today, to fashion us a key. And from the minds of those who enter in, this gift is given us, ours still to give and yet to keep. A gift of value great with life itself. And this, our heritage. In this series of heritage programs, we are privileged to Dr. Paul J. Tillich, author, lecturer, theologian, philosopher, and member of the faculty, Harvard Divinity School, Harvard University. In this second program, Dr. Tillich and his guests discuss the place of religion in the philosophy of life. Dr. Tillich is joined by Dr. Robert C. Johnson, Professor of Systematic Theology, Pittsburg Theological Seminary, and Mr. Walter E. Wiest, Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion and Christian Ethics, Pittsburg Theological Seminary.
Dr. Tillich, through the years you have written a great deal and spoken a great deal about philosophy of life or a philosophy of life. What do you conceive to be the place of religion in a philosophy of life? Do you feel that religion is necessary to such a philosophy?
Yes, I certainly feel so, but everything depends what you mean with the word religion. My most favorite description of what religion is that it's the answer to the question, what is the meaning of my life? For what do I live? Why have I come into this existence? Where do I go? What's my relation to the short time in which I live, and perhaps to an eternity which is above past and future? Now, all these are questions which every human being has somewhere in a corner of his soul, and nobody can really escape these questions. And what religion does is to try to answer these questions, and above all, the main question, what is the meaning of my life and life generally?
Do you feel that values, moral values, are intrinsically necessary to such a philosophy of life?
Yes, I think that life in a special dimension, I call it the dimension of spirit, which we have only in human beings in the world as far as we know it now. Maybe that there are other beings who also have this character which I call spirit. Now, wherever this spirit works and moves, there the basic foundation, the foundation of everything else, is morality. But again, I must say this has only sense if I say what I mean with morality. I mean with it all those activities of man, internal and external acts, in which he actualizes himself as a person, in which he becomes what he by nature is and should be, namely a person. So morality is not what many people think, a obedience to tables of laws, to all kinds of prescriptions which God, man, or society may give us. But morality is the realization of oneself as a person, and every act in which we do this is a moral act.
Then, Dr. Tillich, when you have spoken about the misunderstanding which is represented in what you have called moralism that many people have about the Christian faith, you're not rejecting morality, but something else.
Yes, now, the distinction between moralism and morality is that morality is the right thing, and moralism is its distortion, it's the wrong thing. Moralism is an attitude in which, as I just said, we follow external laws, like the laws of the state or the law of the Ten Commandments, or even the law of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, simply as laws instead of considering them as expressions of what we human beings essentially are and therefore should be. They are nothing which is strange to us, which is imposed to us from outside, but it's we ourselves put against ourselves. That's what I call a moral law. And now a moralist is a man who doesn't see this, who simply considers the moral laws as something which comes from outside, and where he tries to be as correct as possible, following what he considers to be the commandments of God, or the commandments of the church, or the commandments which is now probably the most important way, namely of society, especially of his own suburban society, with all its conventions. Now that's what I would call moralism. And that's just the opposite of morality, because morality is the free realization of a person as a person, and not the subjection to strange laws.
Could I ask you one more thing about that area of problems or questions? If we say that we will not follow moralism, then very often we find people reacting. I think some of us find this in our students in classes reacting this way. We often get the reaction, then what guides have we for making particular decisions in this very complicated kind of world in which we live? If we can't follow the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule and moral principles of this kind, what do we follow when we're making these decisions?
No, this demands a long answer. And I will give you this answer as short as I can. The first principle of all moral action is love, but not love in the sense in which it's often used today, the sentimental form of love, which has nothing to do with morality, which is simply an emotion. But morality as but love as the reunion with, as I call it so, what is separated. Now in this case, what is separated are the other human beings, and also nature as a whole. And love is the power which reunites us with other human beings and with nature, and even with ourselves, and certainly with the ground of our being, the divine ground of our being. So love is the universal reuniting power. And everything is good which comes out of this reuniting power of love, and nothing is good, even it's the strictest obedience to a moral law, which does not come out of this power of love. Now, love has a character which nothing else has, namely it listens to the concrete situation here and now. I have to make decisions, moral decisions, each time, not only according to the principle of love, but also to the very concrete situation. When I am here in this moment talking with you, there must be some kind of love between us, but this kind is changed by the concrete situation. And an hour later, when I am, let's say, in my family or in the hospital or somewhere else, then my love principle would be applied in a different way, because the situation demands something else. Now, between love and the concrete situation, the movement goes. But now you probably will ask me one more question. What then about the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule and the Sermon on the Mount and all this? They are rules of wisdom. They are based on human experience and put together in these short, all-embracing principles. And we must use them not as commandments which we have to obey, but as advices born out of the wisdom of mankind. And so we have actually three elements in every moral decision. And if you look at your own moral acts, you will find that this is a quite exact description. Ultimately, the principle of love. Without love, no moral act at all. Because love also includes justice. Justice is the backbone of love. Without justice, love is sentimental. Then second, the wisdom of the great lawgivers, as Moses, as Jesus, as the golden rule. And then finally, the very special situation here and now, which each time demands a decision. Now, out of these three elements, a moral decision would come.
Dr. Tillich, you have been dealing here with the very heart of the Christian religion or the Christian faith. I wonder if, in light of what you have just said, you would care to say what the place of the Christ is in this, the relationship of the Christ to the moral life, to moral commandments.
Yes, now this is, their double answer can be given. The first is very obvious. The manifestation of the principle of love in an unique and incomparable way is the cross of Jesus, who is called the Christ. And there we have a life which is in every moment determined by God and therefore by love, and which never has a conflict between himself and God, himself and love. So I would say the first is the manifestation of the principle of love in a personal life, in a real personal life. Then the second is something else. And this brings me back to your question on moralism. We didn't discuss before what is the motivation of the moral act. How are we able to act morally at all? We certainly are not able simply by trying to obey the moral law. The more seriously we take this, the more the despair is into which we fall. People like Paul and Augustine and Luther and Calvin are great examples of this. So there must be another power which makes us love in the right way in the concrete situation. And this power I would call the power of grace or of reconciliation. And this power is manifest also in the picture of Jesus as a Christ in the New Testament. So he reveals both the principle of love and the way in which love can be actualized.
Would you say that this makes the church necessary to this kind of morality or moral living?
The church, you ask?
Yes. Is Christ known other than through the church?
No. The church is for me the living tradition of these principles which I just have developed, and only within the church there is the possibility of receiving this power directly. But I must here make a qualification. If you say the church, then this sounds very much as the churches as we see them today in this country and in the Western world, where we have Christian churches, and a few Christian churches also in other continents. Now, of course, in these churches, the church is present. But the church is not only present in the so-called Christian churches. It's present wherever the Spirit, the divine Spirit, grasps the human spirit. And this happens not only in the churches, it happens also outside these churches, which sometimes I have called for this reason the latent churches in opposition to the manifest church. So my concept of church is much larger than the churches which you can see at the crossroads or at Middletown or somewhere. I think of the present, of the, I call it the spiritual community, which is present not only in all these churches, but also far beyond them in so-called secular groups of all kinds, in other religions, in Judaism, and so on. So if I answered your question with yes, then I must now qualify my yes by the distinction of the manifest and the latent church.
Are you saying now that the manifest church is the institutional church as we know it in history? The latent church is the church which is other than or outside of the institutional church? And if this is what you're saying, are you in reality saying that Christ is available to morality outside of the institutional church?
Yes. Now, first a little qualification to this word. When I hear the word institutional church, I think not only of the minister and the elders and the church building and the services and all this, but I also think at the personal life of the members of these churches, their personal religion, their encounter with God. This is one thing. Then the other thing is what I call the latent church. There also we have groups which are organized more or less. I think of some political groups, some youth movements, from some social groups, all kinds of communities which are driven by something which belongs to the principle of love. And there is also the individuals in it who have their personal life. And I must tell you, in my whole life, I have met so many people of whom I had the feeling that the love of Christ was driving them without their knowing that it has anything to do with Christ. And if I was asked by students of theology how I could say such a thing, I simply say because Jesus said it. Namely in Matthew 24, he praises those who work love without even knowing his name.
Dr. Tillich, you were speaking of the love of Christ, which is at the center of the Christian faith. You were speaking of this in relation to morality a little while ago. This suggested another question to me, which has some relation to what you've just been saying also, I think. Let me describe very briefly the situation out of which the question comes. About 4 years ago or so, I was involved in a conference of an international character of representatives of student Christian movements around the world. And one speaker who was invited to speak to this group was a French existentialist, a follower of Jean-Paul Sartre. The theme of the conference was Jesus Christ the Reconciler. I assume that when we speak of the love of Christ, we mean also a power to reconcile people and heal their separations and divisions. But the existentialist said, he not being a Christian, that for him, Christ was not an answer here, but part of the problem. That what kept him apart from other people was more than anything else this business of Jesus Christ being taken as an absolute, which he could not accept. And therefore, to him, this was not an answer at all. What would you say in response?
I would agree with him, as the situation is, not as the situation should be. The situation is now so, for innumerable people inside and outside the churches, that the answer, Jesus Christ, as it's usually said, is entirely ununderstandable. And one of the reasons for this is a very seemingly unimportant thing, but actually very important, namely that the word Jesus Christ is not a name like Paul Tillich, but that Jesus Christ means the man Jesus who has the function to be the Christ. And Christ means the bringer of a new eon, as it was called, a new reality, a new being, as I like to call it, a new power of love, or however you want to call it. And if you say Jesus, who is the bringer of a new eon, a new period of history, then of course the whole situation changes. Then at least the question becomes meaningful. Can we say this? And what does that mean? So I am very much in sympathy with this existentialist. If the acceptance of Jesus as a Christ is a doctrinal law imposed on people who don't even know what the word means, then I would say we have to rebel against it. And my whole theological work is an attempt to interpret the meaning of this statement that Jesus is the Christ.
Some years ago, Dr. Tillich, referring to the present situation of the church, you wrote a book, or a collection of essays were published under the title The Protestant Era. And I think you made the statement at that time that you had suggested the title, The End of the Protestant Era. I wonder if you would tell us what you intended in this title.
Yes, I wrote a paper, and it was printed as an article under the title The End of the Protestant Era. And then with a question mark, The End of the Protestant Era, question mark. And then a collection of many of my articles was made, and we discussed the problem of the title. And I said, now, they all deal with Protestantism in some way. Why don't we call it The End of the Protestant Era, question mark? Publisher said, it's the rules of publishing to have a question mark in the title. So we make it without a question mark, The End of the Protestant Era. Then other friends of mine came, theological professors, Protestants, and said, don't say this, and the Catholics will say that I have said Protestantism has come to an end, which I didn't mean either. And so I was between these two alternatives, and then I think we called it simply Protestantism, or the Protestant principle. And but the article, The End of the Protestant Era, question mark, was still in the book as one article. And there you can see what I mean with it, namely the question, can we have this kind of free, autonomous, as I call it, self-deciding, self-determining kind of religion which Protestantism is, which is always able to criticize all authorities, and which is always able to unite faith and doubt. Can we keep that up? Or has the time come where people are so tired of making decisions of their own that they prefer to go under authorities, religious or quasi-religious political authorities?
It has been several years now since you wrote this essay. What do you feel about the present situation? Do you feel that we're in a position now where people can accept this kind of responsibility, or willing to? Or
no, excuse me, I am afraid that it's almost the opposite, that we are now going in the same direction of conformism, which I was afraid of when I wrote this article. And this kind of conformity has also sociological reasons. For instance, the big corporations, the suburban kind of life, in which any individual non-conformism is much more difficult than it was in the big cities or in a period of the individual businessmen. We have now a sociological structure which almost drives us towards conformity. And I don't know what will become of Protestantism if conformism is completely victorious. So the problem is as serious today as it was 10 years ago, and perhaps even more serious.
Perhaps we're even beyond the Protestant era at the present time, if the other was the end.
We might be a little bit beyond it already, and the question is, what can we do with Christianity if the Protestant principle must go underground, as it perhaps must very soon.
We were talking, Dr. Tillich, about the fact, rather you mentioned the fact just a few moments ago, that the name Jesus Christ has no meaning for a lot of people in today's world. You have dealt a great deal also with the general problem of the symbols and language associated with our religious tradition, and the problem that is raised for us in this respect today. Would you make some comment about that?
Yes, now I would say that we have learned now in the last 10 years, I think very generally, that religious language is symbolic language. That means that you cannot take any religious symbol literally. If you do so, you bring it down to a level to which it doesn't belong, to a level of the table or of our talks with each other, but religion belongs to the level of the infinite, the ultimate, the unconditional. And if we speak about it, we must use ordinary words and objects. But if we do so, we must at the same time know that we now use them not in their ordinary meaning, but in another meaning. And this meaning I call symbolic. And symbolic is not something less than literal, but it's something more. It is a power in itself. A great symbol cannot be created at will. It grows and it may die, but it's not at our disposal as signs are. And so when somebody says only a symbol, I get angry and tell my students never say only a symbol, even if I myself slip with my tongue sometimes. But say just a symbol, that's the right thing here and nothing else.
You are assuming that words are symbols as well as such things as the Star of David and the cross.
Exactly. Words can be symbols, historical figures can be symbols, art has symbols, and the last one, religion, has symbols.
We have been visiting with Dr. Paul J. Tillich, distinguished philosopher and theologian, and member of the faculty, Harvard Divinity School, Harvard University, and his guests, Dr. Robert C. Johnson and Mr. Walter E. Wiest, both of the faculty of the Pittsburg Theological Seminary. In part 3 of this series, Dr. Tillich and his guests will discuss religion and psychotherapy. This program was produced in the studios of station WQED in Pittsburgh.
And from the minds of those who enter in, this gift is given, and this, our heritage.